Hello, everyone. You've reached Christian-apologist.com. I'm S.J. Thomason, and today I'm here with Jonathan Sheffield, and he is going to discuss his game plan with Richard Carrier. He's going to do a debate with Richard Carrier starting on December 10th. And so I'm going to turn it over to Jonathan to introduce himself, tell us a little bit about why he's a Christian, and how he encountered Richard Carrier. So, Jonathan.
Oh, thank you once again, SJ, for having me on your show. Really love the work that you're doing in sharing the gospel to others. For your audience, my name is Jonathan Sheffield. I come from a Christian background, so both my mother and my father were both Christians. Actually, my dad started off as an atheist and later came to convert over to Christianity. As for myself, I grew up in the Anglican church, member of the Episcopal Church since I was born. And very early on, going to Sunday school and to church, and just sitting in church and hearing the scriptures read, I started realizing, how much I needed Christ and as my Savior in my life. Understanding my sinful nature, and you know, it was one of those things that I came to believe and accept the gospel, and feel safe and secure in my salvation. So, over the last 2 years, I have started up a ministry with my dad, and focusing on defending the Christian scriptures. And I thought one of the best ways to do that, and it's kind of interesting that SJ shared with me her affinity for C.S. Lewis, who was also an Anglican. He was able to bring a lot of basic Christian doctrines and views in a lot of his works, especially his Narnia series. And for myself, I wanted to take this sometimes difficult, misunderstood topic and turn it into cartoon animation. So over the course of the last 2 years, I've done a number of animations defending the reliability of the Bible. And recently I started moving into sharing the gospel and challenging some of the theories of the atheists. So with that said, how did this whole debate begin with Dr. Carrier? So it was actually interesting. In my most recent animation, which was a challenge to modern atheists and some of their challenges to Christianity, um, Dr. Dr. Carrier was actually called in to assist one of the atheists on a Christian Facebook community, and we started talking back and forth. One of the first things that Dr. Carrier suggested was to first read his book, which I have here, which is Hitler, Homer, Bible, Christ, which actually goes over his scholarship on the long ending of Mark. And so after I got finished reading that book, I've gone over some of his other works as well. I reached out to Dr. Carrier and thought, well, instead of the Facebook community, let's go ahead and have an open formal debate. And I would like to actually do it on his personal blog. This way, it can open up the conversation to a number of the atheists, so we can share the Christian perspective and our views on this matter as well, and to allow his community to open up and ask questions as well. So after sitting down with Dr. Carrier last month, we set up the framework of the debate. We wanted to talk about the long ending of Mark and its significance on the Bible in terms of reliability. And we set it up for actually a 6-week discussion starting on December 10th.
Well, that's great. So, yeah, the long ending of Mark. So, for viewers who don't realize what that is, there's a portion at the end of Mark that is believed to have been added after the original part of Mark was written. So, some atheists have suggested that that must mean that Jesus didn't resurrect, or that Mark didn't believe that Jesus resurrected. But what would you say to that? I have a response to that, but I
Yeah.
want to see what you have to say.
Well, yeah, no, and I think it's important because I think over the last 200 years, there's been a new evolutionary view within Christian communities and in the scholarly world that has asserted a few things in regards to the long ending of Mark. I think it's important to understand why are me and Dr. Carey even discussing this. But first, as you pointed out, the passage does contain the witness to the resurrection. But there's a couple other points that we have to think about. First, mains, main mainstream scholarship has asserted within the last couple hundred years that Mark was first. So when we concede that position, and then we add that, the long ending of Mark, which talks about his apostles witnessing to the real life resurrection of Christ, and then we take that and say, okay, now Mark is really the basis document for Matthew and Luke. Now it starts to really display this evolutionary cycle of how the Bible came into being. So if you think about it, Dr. Carey says, well, I'm already being told by mainly scholarship this is not something that he invented, that Mark was first. Then you guys added this passage, and if you added it, why did you add it? It's now speaking about a historical resurrection. And then this document is the basis for Matthew and Luke. So then those testimonies, which seem to talk about the resurrection as well, then we start to question, did anything actually like this ever occur? Which Dr. Carrier's taking the next logical position, saying, well, if these were all just added in, what was the origins of these stories? And therefore comes the Christ myth theory.
Yeah, and I wanted to point out I've actually got a Bible here, and I'm in the end of Mark, and it makes it very clear, even in anyone's copy of the Bible. This is a NIV Bible, but it has in italics the actual ending of Mark that they have contested. So that portion that might have been added later. But just before that, one thing that I did want to point out that I don't think that Richard Carrier and others might have noticed is it says right here, "Don't be alarmed," he said. "You are looking for Jesus, the Nazarene, who was crucified. He has risen. He is not here." So that is not contested, and it's in Mark. And so to me, that makes it quite clear that Mark believed that Jesus was resurrected. And so I would just add that little note there. And actually, one person who drew my attention to that, and you have mentioned him earlier, is David Wood. So his Acts 17 ministry, he actually pointed that out one time to someone who was arguing with him, and I like to hear that. And I thought, oh yeah, that's true, that's in there. So
Okay. Uh, well, yeah, and I think for Christians, we want to go ahead and demonstrate why we believe that the Bible is reliable, including this last section of Mark. And I think, you know, if we look at what's happening in mainstream Christian scholarship, it has created these views which have enabled others to attack, such as the resurrection of Christ, because it is, as you point out, he is risen. Excellent example that speaks to the resurrection of Christ. But those last 16 verses, the last 12 verses are very key because of the fact that it also acknowledges that the witnesses or the apostles were eyewitnesses to that particular event. One of the other things that they attack on Mark is that it wasn't actually written by Mark, so therefore there wasn't an eyewitness to the event, and it came 40 or 50 years later after the so-called event, and then it was added. It starts to really question the reliability of these documents, which helps build the case for Dr. Carrier, for Muslims even, to attack the resurrection of Christ, which is the focal point of Christianity.
that's true. But I think that one thing that I don't know if that I found very compelling is when I read in J. Warner Wallace's book Cold Case Christianity, he pointed out something, a lot of evidence in the Bible that indicates that Mark was a good friend of Peter, and so though Mark wasn't an eyewitness, he was best buddies with Peter. And some of the proof that that Jim Wallace pointed out was he pointed out how Mark. Wasn't one to disparage Peter. So if you actually look at some of the things that Peter did that were a little embarrassing, Mark actually didn't really include them in his book here, probably because they were good friends.
Well, yeah, and from the historical testimony that we do have available, that is the empirical data that we have that Mark was Peter's scribe, and he had actually written down the sermons that Peter was preaching while he was at Rome. So it's a important testimony. You don't just have to rely on one piece of evidence for that, but we have many pieces available. But I think so. The question is, I think, comes about how do we go about defending the reliability of our texts in regards to my upcoming debate with Dr. Perry. Not trying to give away too much of my strategy, but there are certain things that Dr. Carrier um, is open to, as far as, when we think of the textual evidence or what has come down um, in the textual evidence. These are real biblical artifacts. They're not hallucinations. We can feel and we can touch them. We don't have just one witness. I think what's important to understand is that the community of believers that went out and started the missionaries and setting up the Christian communities weren't just one either. I think what's fascinating as we look throughout the Roman Empire and Christianity spread not only in the Greek-speaking world, but in the Latin world as well, in the Aramaic world, Coptic uh, groups, Ethiopia, uh, Gothic. We have all this testimony that is being represented as speaks basically to the same Jesus, same life, death, birth, and resurrection of Christ. And we're speaking of independent witnesses that don't necessarily agree on a lot of things from a theological position, um, from celebrating certain festivals. There was constant, just like it is today in Christian circles, there's a lot of back and forth sometimes. But what we do see represented throughout the ancient Christian communities is a representation of the same four gospels, coming up with the same four authors, communicating the same message about the life, death, and resurrection of Christ.
Yeah, I agree, and I think that's a good point. Is just the growth of Christianity. I think that speaks to what Gamaliel said in Acts 5, I believe it was, when he said that you don't have to arrest these people if their mission is based on is from God. You won't be able to put it out. And so he also pointed out, Gamaliel also pointed out some of the cases where the mission was not based on God and it just died out. So he said, if their mission is based on God, and what's neat is by 313, between 5 and 6 million people were worshiping Jesus, and they didn't even have legal protections until that year. So it really speaks to how this amazing, very peaceful movement had started, and that is in contrast to other religions. Many religions started more in a, like the Muslim faith, for example, started in warriors, with warriors, even including Muhammad.
Yeah, um, I think that raises a good point because I know I've been questioned in the atheist community. It's like, well, Christianity is just like Mormonism. It's just like Muslims. And if you think about it, there's obviously a couple of different differences. First, Muhammad had an inner experience in a cave. how do we actually validate that that ever happened? Joseph Smith, he received the golden plates. Once again, we don't have those documents. How do we test that? Now, you brought up a good point with, those figures of the Roman Empire actually investigating Christianity. We have Herod, we have Pilate, we have Festus, we have uh, Gallio. They're all interviewing Christianity to investigate what is happening in there. And what sometimes atheists don't get, all the Roman Empire had to do was either produce the body, I mean, they had state power, they were in full control, or they could have wrote a credible tome explaining what had happened. Hey, Christians claim this. We figured where everything was out, and that would have been the end of Christianity right there. But as you're well aware, Christianity for the next 300 years suffered with torture and murder. But there was no any official response, even though the Roman Empire was investigating Christianity to disprove our claims that were published all over the ancient world in the Gospels.
Yeah, that's a good point that people don't argue that often, but that's a good point. Is obviously the Romans and the Jews had it in their interest to try to find a body and to write against it, but you don't see that. That's actually very interesting. A very good point.
Yeah, and I think over the last couple of 100 years, and I know you talked about this in some of your broadcasts, but we really look at the development of first the Christ myth theory really coming out in two major works. First, David Strauss, who actually was one of the first to publish a serious discussion in the late 19th century that Christ himself was a myth. So that's the first time in history. So if you think about it, 1800 years after the events happened, um, the Roman Empire had great historians. Even though some of the comments by Josephus are attacked to discredit his comments on Jesus, what we don't have from Jesus or Josephus is a actual tome refuting what the Christians said. Um, and 1800 years later, David Strauss comes out with a book that really first suggests that Christ was a myth. And then, you know, uh, Karl Marx reads his books, and what happens after that is the rest of the story. But you can see where Karl Marx was influenced by David Strauss, who propagated an assertion that this whole Christ Bible thing, it's all a myth. And I think we even have The Golden Bough by Sir James Fraser here. Really good book because it really talks about, and once again, late 18th century coming out propagating that Christianity was the basis of all this convergence of different religious thought, which formed the epicenter to create this religious belief. So
Very interesting. Yeah, and I didn't know that about Karl Marx and David Strauss, so I'm glad you shared that.
yeah, I think it's important to understand one of Karl Marx's biggest influences in his life. He read David Strauss, who promoted this view, and then we have communism. Uh, so
Yeah, that ended up, being directly responsible for the murder of over 100 million people last century.
yeah, I think it's
Or starvation, I should say, not murder in all cases. Starvation,
yeah.
murder, death, early demise.
So I think it's important in sharing with your audience that these ideas can be traced back. We understand where these ideas come from, whether from the atheist position, this idea that the text, and I think here's how everything all relates, because within the last 200 years, these theories came out of the German rationalist schools that propagated this idea that the text that has come down and has been preserved through not only the Greek Orthodox churches, but the Western churches as well, and the Aramaic actually represent a text that's secondary in origin, which is really key to the whole debate because their idea and the modern Christian evangelical position is sometime around the third century, the New Testament text that we know of today began its evolutionary process, where texts like the last 12 verses of Mark, the woman in adultery, and about 100 others were conflated in the text over a period of time. Now, it's sort of like the mainstream stream evangelical thought, but if you think about it, Bart Ehrman takes it the next step. He's like, okay, well, why do you say it happened in the fourth century? This conspiracy or this development of the canon could have occurred in the fourth century. And so his idea is that Jesus went from a man to Christ, and it kind of creates this view, this evolutionary view from Jesus to Christ. And then Dr. Carrier, he has taken the next sort of logical step within this viewpoint that, well, it could have all been a myth. So that's why I thought it was important going into this one passage has a huge impact at how we understand how we got the books of the New Testament.
Yeah, and I think one of the myth argument to me is very weak for a number of reasons. I think that, and I think it's great that you brought up the fact that that really didn't come about until hundreds of years later. If someone wanted to say Jesus was a myth, as you said, they would have said that, no doubt, in the early centuries, and we have absolutely no evidence. We have 42 sources within 150 years who have supported Jesus's resurrection or crucifixion, or even the words in the Old Testament. I'm sorry, the words in the New Testament. So I think there are a lot of people. I don't think there was enough time to develop a myth, even for. And I also think that what needs to be considered is the apostles. They were in a position to know if it was a myth. Instead, many of them ended up being crucified or beheaded or had some other torturous means of killing them. So.
Yeah, no, I think it's important, and if we look back in history, and that's why I really do like about Dr. Carrier actually debating this issue with him because he is an actual historian. Um, I mean, his degrees speak for themselves, and so we're going to have a really good historical conversation on this and really understanding the history of the times. But when we talk about myths of the first century, we have a world-renowned myth that we know about. So we have Virgil's Aeneid. And the thing about Virgil's Aeneid, which is so great, first, it's a great work. I loved reading it as a kid. Secondly, is it was produced right around the first century. We know who wrote it, Virgil. We know that he was at the court of Caesar. So we have a lot of information about this myth. And, Virgil speaks about events that happened over 1,200 years ago. But we have all this information. And the ancient world was very aware of myths as well. Peter in the Bible talks about old wives' tales. So, Peter himself, understood, about all these wives' tales and myths and all these other things. So it wasn't like a new concept that people, I think, we live in a world where there's this post-enlightenment view that everyone back then didn't know anything. They were gullible. They would just believe anything. And when we look back at history, this is actually opposite the case. We see this in a number of the works of Roman historians. They actually make fun of a famous historian, Suetonius, as well. Maybe he'll appear if the omens are right. So this idea about myth and associating it with the apostles, with the books, is only of recent development. So it's and it comes out in a time where Christianity and views were being attacked. This new evolutionary idea was being pushed on the New Testament. So it kind of falls in line with what was happening during that period.
Yeah, and I think you bring up a good point too with the idea of saying that people are gullible because if we just look at people, people are naturally not necessarily, there are certainly gullible people, but I don't see there being any more gullible back in the first century than they are now. It's just there's certainly some gullible people and there are some very skeptical people. And to claim that that all of the apostles were just gullible, gullibility doesn't drive someone to preach illegally for several decades, risk imprisonment, risk death, purely because they believed in something that didn't even exist.
Yeah, and the bigger part of that argument that you bring up, SJ, is were the Roman Empire, the Pharisees, and also the Sadducees also gullible, where they weren't able to produce an official response to Christianity. I mean, nowadays, if the state government cannot convict you, it probably means that you're innocent. And as I said before, we had high officials of the Roman Empire actually investigating Christianity. And it's kind of interesting to note that this is how they investigated and took notice of cults. It's actually interesting that we actually have a historical reference to the Roman Empire actually investigating the Bacchus cults. And they went out and sent their highest, most trusted leaders, because if you think about it, you're going to send someone that you trust to go ahead and investigate. And we see the same thing with Christianity. And when we look at what had happened with the Christians being expelled from Jerusalem, Pliny the Younger's letter talking about how we should handle Christians, and even with the Edict of Milan in 313, where Christianity first got sort of state power recognition, in the East they were still being persecuted. So what we don't have is any official response from any member of the Roman Empire, even though we have figures such as Justin Martyr and Tertullian of North Carthage asking the Roman government to release the official acts of Pilate. We don't have that. So they had the historians in place. They had Tacitus, they had Josephus, they had Pliny the Younger, but we don't have any official tome from the Roman Empire disputing what the gospel claims to have happened.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. I think that's really good. And yeah, I like that. I was just trying to think of something else that you said that I think Richard Carrier has offered. I think he said this, and I think you mentioned it a second ago. How do you counter his argument that Christianity just grew out of a bunch of myths that was, going back to some other gods, like it's a compilation of a bunch of different belief systems? How would you counter that argument?
Well,
Like,
that,
what I'm trying to say is there another belief system that had a crucified savior who, it's basically what he's sort of saying.
well, yeah, and if we think about this, and this is why the historical argument is very important. We see with Romulus, the Senate declared that he also rose from the dead. Uh, but what we know regarding that situation, because Plutarch kind of throw that out as, I would say, in my view, making fun of Christianity. But what we have in all these events, so when we look at Muhammad, we look at Hinduism. He had an experience under the tree. Most of these, I guess, tribal or these views, these pagan views that were held, uh, all these are based on an inner experience. So when we look at, well, how do we even falsify something like that? I can't tell what Muhammad heard in the cave. I can't, determine what these pagan civilizations, when they were praying to their gods and these experiences that they felt, are really, you really can't falsify that. Christianity is the one religion that you can falsify. You either had to produce the body, which the Roman Empire could have done, or they could have produced a tome refuting what the Christians were saying. So when we look at all these other religions, the difference is we have a method that is very easy to falsify it. The Roman Empire had state power, they had the historians, they had the scholars. While Josephus' comments are attacked, what we don't have from Josephus is a tome refuting Christianity. We don't have that from Tacitus. We don't have that from any of these ancient scholars, and they did try. Celsius and the information that we got tried to attack Christianity. Uh, Profertire, he's an excellent example of an attempt to ridicule Christianity, but his attempts were unsuccessful as well. So even though they tried, Christianity is the one religion, and I definitely want atheists who are out there who promote this view that everyone was gullible and no one understands, or the Roman Empire didn't care. It's just not historically accurate. In the scriptures, we have all these high figures investigating Christianity to find out what was going on. And what does Paul say? You know, we have all these witnesses. We didn't do this under the cover of darkness. This was all out in the open. What we have happening is an incredible event. 50 days later, Peter goes to Jerusalem. I mean, think about this, SJ. I'm from Brooklyn, New York. Can you imagine if I said, hey guys, in Times Square, this guy rose from the dead. And in 50 days, I'm going to come back. I'm going to tell you all about it. Now, how many journalists would be coming out there investigating if any such event actually ever happened? I mean, we're talking about the Temple Mount. The Jewish scholars, where are their tomes refuting what the Christians were claiming in their Gospels? And this is something that other religions cannot boast. And this whole idea that Christianity is an evolutionary idea based on the convergence of all these ideas, I know where that idea comes from. You know, it wasn't. None of the historians talked about that. We see with David Strauss and with Sir James George Fraser, this whole idea developing within the last 200 years.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think just to piggyback on what you're saying as far as how Christianity differs from some other faiths is many other faiths are based on a single person's uh, accounts. So just as you mentioned, Muslim is based on what Muhammad said. If you look at Mormonism, it's based on what Joseph Smith said. You could go to Buddhism and Confucianism and all of these different belief systems that people have, and they're all based on a single person's ideas. The only one that kind of is an exception, and Hinduism is very complex and has very many different streams, so it's based on more than one author. But if you go to the Bible's based on 40 different authors over 1,500 years in 3 different continents. The Christianity actually is the only religion that really isn't still centered where it originated. So Christians are all over the world in every culture. And what's very interesting is Jim Wallace did write something on this. I saw a blog that he wrote where he looked at all of the other faiths, and he pointed out how everyone knows Jesus Christ, even people who are Hindus. They all seem to know who Jesus Christ is, and so I think that's very fascinating. And then one last thing I wanted to point out that distinguishes Christianity is Jesus fulfilled 330 prophecies, or even more, but 330 Old Testament prophecies, and that in itself speaks to God working through. And Isaiah 53 and Psalm 22, and I could go on and on, but it's just beautiful, really. It's
Yeah,
such a wonderful thing.
yeah, no, and you raise a good point, and this is why it's so important, at least from my standpoint, to defend the reliability of the scriptures, because once the reliability or the documented evidence, in this case, the gospel publications, the letters of Paul, and all the other books, if that goes out the window, then it discredits everything that we say. And this is where, you know, Dr. Carrier has a point, and where he moves through in his viewpoint. If and he brings this up at the very beginning of his book on the long ending of Mark, is well, if this was added, after the fact and doesn't represent any real historical event, then reliability goes out the window. Your inerrancy, all these concepts get to look down upon. And then if you're telling me that the other publications in Matthew and Luke kind of cribbed from Mark, well, it's basing its testimony off forged documents. So it's like going into a court and we have a witness statement. Then we find out that witness statement was appended with something that he saw that he never really saw. That document would be thrown out, and any witnesses that heard that testimony would also be thrown out as well. So that's why this is such a big issue, and that's why I kind of tell my Christian community is, I'm not really trying to divide with this issue, but bigger it has bigger points. The Muslims use this all the time to attack an actual resurrection. But the beauty of Christianity is we don't just have one book, as you pointed out before. We have four independent testimonies. Christianity did not have control of anything the first 300 years. They only got legitimacy afterwards. Unfortunately, Muslims, they had a sultan that was able to form the Quran into one text later after its development. Christianity never had that. There was always constant fighting. We have all these independent witnesses that are basically witnessing to the same life, death, and resurrection of Christ. And in any court of law, that would be conclusive.
Yeah, and I think that brings up another point. I've heard Richard Carrier talk about his claims that the Gospels are. He basically throws the Gospels out and says that we shouldn't even look at all of them, and of course doesn't really think about that John. No one's making the claim that John came from the Book of Mark. John's completely different in many ways. But the other thing one thing that I did is I actually just looked at one thing that Richard Carrier does not deny is Paul's writings. And so I just looked at what Paul said and went through I actually created a blog at one point that talked about just from Paul alone, we have enough evidence that Jesus rose from the dead. So even if we just had Paul, but we really actually have even external sources that give us all of that information too.
Yeah. And I talked about this with Dr. Carrier, where he does believe he accepts the 7 letters of Paul. He accepts 7 letters of Paul. Once again, I believe we have 14. But the argument that has developed over the last 200 years has given a lot of ammunition. So this is where Dr. Carrier, when he goes in with a number of Christian apologists, he has an advantage on that. Many in the mainstream communities, especially our scholars, believes this. So when we have Christians coming up to Dr. Carrier in a debate, and they already concede to a point that we don't know who the authors of the Gospels are. Mark was first. Who said Mark was first? Which really goes into a different issue. But when you have this, and then we add on the last 12 verses of Mark, and then Luke and John, it really takes away the credibility of the New Testament. I hear what you're saying on the 7 letters, but if we look at 2/3 of the books of the New Testament were corrupted or forged, it really downplays the whole argument that we can trust any of the information that's coming out of it, because then it shows the system of chaos and scattered. So really what I'm going to do in this upcoming debate is really go to the historical records to help explain I hate to use the word development, canon, but how we got the books of the Bible. Want to give away all my all my ammunition on Dr. Carrier because again he really does know the history. He knows the periods. He's gone over the scholarship quite well. But what I can assure the audience out there and others, um, we're going to present a really great case for not only this passage, but the reliability of the Bible as a whole as it relates to the last 12 verses of Mark.
Good. I think you've hammered on this a couple of times with respect to Mark being the first book. You can point out that the early church fathers attributed the first book to Matthew. So so Matthew is and I wrote a blog on that once because I looked at the different points of view on people taking Mark as the first or people taking Matthew. And there's no one early on who said that Mark is the first. The church fathers felt Matthew, and even if you look at the order in which they're in the Bible, Matthew's first. So.
Yeah, and I think it's important to understand what the cat. Could you bring up an excellent point? What is the basis for Mark being the first? Now, once again, as I've said, within the last 200-300 years, this position came up very, very early on. I think it was Christopher Stott in 1786, who was part of the German schools that first introduced that idea. So if we're going back to the empirical data, and this I mean the documents of the time, where is he drawing his conclusion that Mark was first? I mean, you have a big fight between the Greek and the Aramaic churches over was Matthew published in Greek or Aramaic? And even though there's a big fight between the Greeks and the Aramaic churches, they both say Matthew was first. Every apostolic ancient church said Matthew was first. No one said that Mark was first. So it really goes back to where these ideas are coming from. And if you look at the evolutionary development of the canon, it makes sense for them to say, well, Mark's the shortest, so it had to be first. But are we creating a narrative based on our current worldview to support that position, or are we actually looking at the empirical data? In this case, the testimony that came out, because we're talking about not only the testimony, but they all came up and said it was Mark. So if me and you were going to decide, we have a book here, and we're going to come up with a name, what's the probability that we're going to name the same author, SJ?
Yeah.
And then we have to, and what's the probability that we're going to come up with which book came first? And so when we look throughout the testimony, the written testimony from the ancient world, they all come to the same conclusion in different languages, different theological positions, and groups that were fighting amongst themselves. The one thing that they did agree on was that Matthew was first. And it was actually Matthew that wrote it. So you actually have two parts to it. They both received Matthew, they all received Matthew, and they all basically said Matthew was the author for a document that didn't have their name on it. So that's pretty extraordinary from that standpoint.
Yeah, I like that point of view. That's very interesting, and that actually is a good counter to the arguments, some of the arguments I've seen from atheists on the authorship and how it doesn't say I Matthew wrote this in here. So
it doesn't, which means so if you think about it, the Christians did have to deal very early on with competing groups or groups that said, "Hey, I have the true text." Now, what's interesting, it's a great case in point because when we look at the Gnostic groups, so whether we look at Marcion and his followers, the Valentians, Cerinthius, we had all these competing groups. Now, what's interesting about the Gnostic text, and historically, we can look back at Nag Hammadi, we see 50 different texts. Now, what's interesting is they all disagree amongst themselves. There's no unity. Um, Everyone's saying that we have the true text, but they all disagree. What you find with uh, the historical Christian apostolic churches is they were fighting amongst themselves on all these different theological positions, the date of Easter, but they basically all came up with the same text, naming the same author. So this idea that the Gospels are anonymous are another new revolutionary idea. Because if you think about it, if I'm a proponent of Christianity, it does make sense to attack the authorship, because if you don't have eyewitnesses, whose testimony do you have? Even though I won't really share too much on this, but when they claim that the authors are anonymous, it creates a whole litany of different issues that I'll be discussing in my debate with Dr. Carrier, because they create more problems for themselves when they say there's authors are anonymous than when they assign it to the individual authors that we accept.
I like that. Yeah, that's and I'm looking forward to listening to your debate. I think that'll be or reading your debate, I guess you said. So I think that'll be fascinating.
Yeah, you know, once again, Dr. Carrier, really intelligent. He knows the field. In a lot of ways, I think, even over modern evangelical textual criticism, Dr. Carrier's degree is in history, so he's more aptly able to discuss the historical formation of the text, as opposed to maybe some scholars who are just looking at some document, determining if it's abridged or unabridged. So um, his degrees and his education really puts him in a good position to really discuss this issue over other evangelical textual scholars. So I'm actually really looking forward to this discussion because of how much history and evidence that we can actually go into on it.
Well, let me ask you this. Speaking of Dr. Carrier, if we go back to his books, and I know you have one of his books right in front of you,
Yes.
in that particular book, does he mention his theory? And I've seen it in a different place, but does he mention his theory of a mass hallucination?
Not on that one. I did go into his. He has this one on the historicity of Jesus. Um, and if you and so he covers, I believe, some of that in here. Um, you know, it, and once again, I think it's important for Christians to understand that a lot of the modern scholarship that has come out of the last 200 years has formed the basis of these theories because of what we have said about the text and the development of the canon, uh, and and that's why I think it's so important that we confront this issue head on, because the alternative is it leads to these views that Dr. Ehrman and Dr. Carrier are promoting, that there was mass hysteria, because we've already given them the high ground on, well, you said you don't know who wrote the authors. And it was done many years later, and then Mark was first, and then you added this. Dr. Carrier's taking the next logical step to say, what was the evolution of the eyes deer? Where did they come from? And Dr. Carrier is, because he's a historian in the ancient world, he really understands the period. So he understands the development of all these other pagan societies, and it leads into a natural discussion. Next logical view is, if what you're saying is true here, then why are we discounting this position? Um, Even though for someone like you and myself, did 500 people mass hallucinate that Paul talks about of all these witnesses?
Well, that's exactly it. In the first place, a hallucination is something that occurs internally. It's impossible for people to share a hallucination, just as it's impossible for people to share a dream. And so the whole argument to me, if people just go back and look at the psychological definition of what a hallucination is, they'll realize that this is completely faulty from the get-go.
Yeah, and even though that probably part of the conversation, I don't think there's going to be a lot of focus on that, but it does draw, it does really pinpoint why Dr. Carrier, where is he getting some of those, why is he resorting to those theories? Same thing for Dr. Ehrman. Why is he taking the position that Jesus started as man and then later on, he was elevated to this Christ? And a lot of it, Dr. Ehrman, he did work under one of the most modern textual critics of our days, who has propagated this view that the text from the Greek churches went under a major revision, um, and really propagated this whole idea that the scriptures are sort of lost and we need to restore them to their original form. These ideas are, very dangerous, to where we have scholars now taking the next logical step to say, well, you guys saying all this isn't reliable, then we have to understand the formation of Christianity. And these are the ideas and theories that they're promoting.
So yeah, I want to recommend. I don't know if have you read this book by Josh and Sean
McDowell.
McDowell?
Yes, I have. Evidence that demands a verdict. It's actually a great book, and I'm glad that you brought that out, because not only does he go over like the Old Testament, but he goes over the New in particular in
Hmm.
regards to the historical resurrection.
Exactly. They actually, what's neat about this is they actually go into what Bart Ehrman said, and they counter it. They offer counter arguments, and they also talk about one of the things that's in this book somewhere in here. It's a really big book, but is they talk about the papyri and different evidence that we have even in the early second century. Um, so that's another fact just to throw in there.
Oh yeah. I think the beauty of Christianity, as far as from the documentation that we have over any of the other literary classics, is not only do we have, over 10,000 copies of the Latin New Testament, we also have it in Greek, we have it in Aramaic, we have it in Coptic, we have it in Ethiopian, we have it in all these languages. So this idea that we have the originals, we don't. But what we do have is the copies that have come down from churches, who we know who presided over them, their theological fights, their views. So when we compare the overwhelming evidence that's out there, um, it really goes to show that we have all these independent witnesses basically saying the same thing. Christianity is always, we've always had biblical criticism very early on. We understand variance. It's nothing new. It was nothing new to the churches. Obviously, they want to make sure to get the scriptures right. But what we have nowadays is this view that the text that we have today has basically been corrupted, and there are ongoing efforts to restore it to basically its original form.
Yeah, so that'll be interesting to hear your debate on that. And I'm thinking I'm going to reread this book. I'm just looking at it. They make some. I just kind of quickly skimmed. There's a lot of neat stuff in here that points to that refutes much of the information that's put out there by people like Bart Ehrman and Richard Carrier. So I'm that might be a good one to use even before your debate to enhance your position.
Yeah, no, and Josh McDowell's book is great. I remember reading it years ago, and one of um, one of the clergymen on Easter Sunday actually uh, actually read portions from it during his sermon. So it was, I remember I was 12, 13 years old hearing that. But I think what's important for this coming debate is it's going to be much different than what people may expect. I think there's going to be a lot of really good information. I think even for the atheist community, and that's why I asked him, to come out and really give their feedback and share, some of their hardest questions that they have for me. One of the things that Dr. Carey and I talked about is about allowing questions, and I think it's great that we don't censor their views. I actually want them to hit me as hard as they can on there because I want to demonstrate that we can document historically the reliability of our New Testament scriptures. Because then now, if the case is made that they're reliable, next thing is okay. Now they're reliable. Are we going to deal with it? What it actually says. So the whole argument to attack the reliability is to discount the historical resurrection, who Jesus was, everything that we understand as Christians, SJ. If you think about it, good lawyers are going to attack your documents because that's how they're going to discredit your testimony. But if we can stand firm and show that our documents are reliable, now it confronts them on the next issue. Okay, if these things happen, what does this mean now?
Yeah, exactly. I think that's going to be great. So maybe we should close up and say for. And I want to mention something. I just did a mock debate with two Christians this morning. A little bit earlier. I don't mean this morning, early this afternoon, and with Andrew and Strateles and Strateles. I forget how he pronounces his name, and Joshua Brister. And we looked at all the tough questions that we could find. We found the problem of evil kind of questions and benevolence and the omnis and all that kind of stuff. And so we did a little mock debate. I represented the atheist side, so I could try to be real tough with them and to see what their answers were on those issues. And so I think it's good to identify all of the toughest questions that they have, and then try to come up with a response. So
Oh
I
no,
agree with you.
okay, no, thank you, SJ.
Yeah, thank you. So now, Jonathan, where do you want to say anything final, or where can people find you? I know that you've got a Twitter presence.
Yeah, I just recently came on Twitter. It's interesting because I do all these animations and these productions with templates. So I haven't been real big in the social media world, but I am on YouTube, and they could just look me up at Jonathan Sheffield. I actually have I think 11 videos right now. And the most recent one was a challenge to atheists, really building on the notion is, you know, I'm giving you evidence. You can falsify Christianity. It's very scientific. So now go ahead and respond to it. So, but yeah, they can find me at Jonathan Sheffield at YouTube. I have about 11 videos that does cover a lot of this information. I actually do have one defending the last 12 verses of Mark. So if anyone wants to see how I've challenged modern evangelical textual scholars as well as Dr. Ehrman, they can see that there. Um,
Oh, that's great. That's great. Yeah, and I don't even know if I'm subscribed to your channel, but I'm definitely going to subscribe. And I'll put your link here so that people will be able to find you in my description too.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I actually did have a de facto debate with Dr. Bart Ehrman on his blog actually last year that actually turned into three different cartoon animations. So it's really fun. Dr. Ehrman was nice enough to actually send me a personal email and invite me onto his blog to allow me to open challenge his theories. And I do appreciate Dr. Carrier as well taking the time to allow me to openly challenge his theory in our formal debate in December. So,
Yeah, you're causing a little bit of a ruffle there, huh?
yeah, I sort of, I was always impressed with the childhood story, The Emperor Has No Clothes, because my favorite character was the kid, and that's sort of how I've always recognized, identified with, as the kid calling out from the crowd that the emperor has no clothes. So I kind of identified with this theory because, I'm just like yourself, SJ. I'm just like a regular Christian believer, just like yourself. I don't have advanced divinity degrees. That's why I call myself the autodictot, which is the self-learn. It's really how like in scriptures it says God uses the foolishness of this world uh, to confound the wise. It's it's sort of what I try to push out there is um, we can take on the Caesars of our day and the Pharisees, being just general fishermen and tax collectors, and you look at the setup that Jesus chose. He went with the simple of the world to go preach his message.
Yeah, yeah. Well, we do have a doctor. We have Luke,
Yeah,
and Paul was highly educated. So we do have a couple of very educated people who are in that group.
yeah,
But I see your point, and I think I'm the same way. I'm self educated. I read as much as I can. I actually found the syllabi of different people teaching apologetics, and I go through their syllabi and buy the books that I see on them. Kind of going. I don't have their instruction in the classroom, but I certainly try to copy some of the materials that they've been using to share the knowledge.
yeah, and I think it's really good for people to come and study these issues so we can present an effective witness to others on why we believe what we do.
Yeah, and I love your emperor has no clothes analogy because I that's another one of my favorites too. I think that was a great story.
Yeah, and the kid I was always impressed with because it kind of emboldens. He's just a little kid. What does he know? But he was not following the emperor. Everyone else realized it, but didn't want to say anything. He was the first one to come out and say, "Hey, the emperor has no clothes." And so, in my ministry over the last 2 years, what I wanted to point out is these theories really have no clothes when you really start to examine what they're really saying. And so that's obviously my hope with my upcoming debate with Dr. Carrier, really to present the evidence in an effectual way to give a strong witness for Christianity.
Okay, yeah, and so to get to that debate, so people are able to find that debate. You said it's on Richard Carrier's blog, right?
That's correct. So on December 10th, I'm sure Carrier will be sending out a posting on there as we get closer to the December 10th day, but it's going to be on Dr. Carrier blog.info, richardcarrier.info, I believe. And starting December 10th, we'll be posting my opening response to Dr. Carrier based on his book on the long ending of March. So I do tell people it's important to read the other side to understand their viewpoints on what he is saying, because I think it does have strong ramifications. Um, but December 10th is going to kick off. I do invite fellow atheists as well as Christian brothers and sisters to come join in. But atheists, I am asking. I know you're followed by a number of community members in the atheist in the atheist field.
Yeah, it's it's actually kind of funny. But yeah, and I know I am followed by over 1,000 atheists on my Twitter account.
That means you're doing something right, SJ.
So they're there. They're and I think they pay more attention to me than Christians do, which is kind of I think Christians might even have me muted in some cases. I'm a big windbag over there. So
Well, I once again, I think your ministry is great. You're preaching the proclamation of the gospel. You know, you kind of embody that when Jesus says in the Beatitudes, "Blessed are the pure in heart, for they'll see God." So it carries over very well to the Christian community. I have spoke with others about the ministry you're doing, and it's a very kindred approach. There's no not doing anything for any particular reason as far as money or anything else. You send a positive message, and I think more Christians need to be like what you're doing out there. Even us who are doing apologetics and everything else, I think the basic believer is what represents Christianity best, because that's what took over the Roman Empire.
Yeah, yeah, and I like your points, and I think that that's true. That's one of the reasons why I actually don't want to make any money on my blogs or that kind of thing, just because I want to show people I'm not in it for the money. I have a day job that does takes care of the bills, so that.
Touche.
And some would say, "Don't give up your day job." Well, no, I'm not going to give up my day job, so I can't afford to give up my day job. But but anyway, I really again I appreciate that you came on, Jonathan. I love the fact that you're doing what you do. I look forward to listening to all of your videos and looking at your cartoon skills. I have zero skills with cartoons, so I'll be certainly amazed. All I can draw is stickman, and I see a stickman in the chat.
Well,
So
well, if you ever need an animation or any artwork, just let me know. It'd be my pleasure to help support your ministry that way.
thank you. Now, how did you come about knowing how to do that? I have no.
Well, my background is in computer programming, so
Oh,
I do a lot of. So my day job is really I do a lot of computer programming in SQL and C++. I do a lot of application development, but mainly I take all the analytics from the organization and consolidate it within a central database warehouse. And then I do all the forecasting and analysis and statistics on everything. So that's really my background. And I have, over time, uh, built up working with templates and different animation tools such as Flash and Animate CC, Toon Boom, is really been able to develop, because from video 1 to video 11, there's been a lot of development there on what I was able to pick up and resources I've been able to use to make the animations even better. So
wow, that's great.
yeah, I know. Even Carrie asked me like on the voiceovers and stuff. I was like, well, I actually use services to do voiceovers because I think it sounds better in the British accent. So I use a lot of British voiceovers because it sounds much cooler when I'm conveying my arguments.
Oh, that's hilarious. You do a different accent? I love that. How
Yeah,
neat.
I have some English and Italian background, so I, I think the British voiceovers come over very well when they're arguing. So, especially with my debate with Dr. Ehrman, when I recreated it, I had a voice actor that I used that really conveyed that young British intellectual type feel. It really carries over really good.
That's very clever. Yeah, there is something. I mean, our American accent seems so unsophisticated, and I agree with you. I love the British accent. It's beautiful. So
Yeah,
they can say a couple of words and they sound very sophisticated.
yeah. So it's part of my marketing ploy to get it over. I said people probably don't want to see me, but a cute little cartoon always does well. So
I like that. Yeah, and actually, I think I will have to get in touch with you because I have zero skills in that, and it shows on my video. So it's like you can tell. So, but I'll have to do that. So, I want to thank everybody for coming in here. I just want to say I see Stickman and Soldier of Yeshua and Coon and Roger McIntosh and Colonel's Crazy Adventure. So there are a few people here in the chat who came and listened, and I appreciate all of that. And so again, go ahead and find us on Twitter and other places, and we'll be chatting more again.
all right, God bless everyone.
God bless everybody. Thank you.